I'm so glad you're here tonight. Walking away from religion can be lonely. You focus inward. You examine your deepest thoughts and desires and motives, and that can be solitary work. But there are other times when that loneliness can be depressing. When you wonder if you're the only one with doubts and if you're the oddball, the aberration, the heretic. And tonight is confirmation for me that many of you walk where I walk. And so I appreciate your presence. I was thinking the other day about how many sermons, talks, and speeches I've given over the course of my life extolling religion. Conservatively, I figure that I've given 60 every year for about 25 years. That's about 1,500 talks. And on average, it takes me about 8 hours to prepare and write and give those talks, which adds up to about 12,000 hours. At 40 hours a week, I've spent at least 6 years of my life thinking and writing and talking about religion. Tonight, as I speak for the first time on the virtues of becoming non-religious, I can't help but be a little embarrassed and a little shocked that you all came to hear me. You know, tonight's title could have been The Risks of Listening to Jim. The truth is, I still know a whole lot more about the religious life than the non-religious one. And if you've been non-religious all your life, what I share tonight as revolutionary may seem fairly elementary. What I offer tonight is not expertise, but a keen awareness of the risks involved in walking away from your religion and the rewards that you can experience. But before I get into all of that, let me offer 5 important clarifications. Clarification number 1. I was a Christian. What I talk about this evening, when I talk about leaving religion, I'm talking about leaving Christianity. While I suspect there are similar risks and rewards in leaving any religion, my experience is limited by my Christian context. So if you're not Christian, I apologize in advance for what doesn't resonate. Hopefully our panelists can fill in the gaps. Clarification number 2. I was a happy Christian. This talk is probably not for everyone, and it wouldn't have been for me 10 years ago. If you're happy with your religious life tonight, you may be in the wrong place. For much of my life, my religion satisfied. I lived out my beliefs with integrity and authenticity. I was happy. And though I've left, I don't look back with regret or guilt. If religion is working for you tonight, I'm glad. But I do worry about how painful this evening could be. Clarification number 3. I am no longer a Christian. Now, tonight is the first time I've ever said those words in a public forum, so you'll forgive me if I'm a little nervous. This is all new, exciting and frightening. In the past couple of years, I've discovered that there are similarities between finally admitting you're non-religious and finally admitting you're gay or lesbian. Tonight is coming out of the closet. Clarification number 4. Religion no longer works for me. I'm not going to spend much time tonight explaining why. I don't need to justify my decision or convince others to make it. When people ask me why I've become non-religious, I've learned that the kindest, most honest reply is simply, for a variety of reasons, religion doesn't work for me anymore. And if they insist on further explanation, I add, religion doesn't make me happy, and I've decided to look for happiness elsewhere. It's hard to argue with happiness. Clarification number 5. This decision was a long time coming. Tonight will not offer 5 easy steps for becoming non-religious. There is nothing easy about it. When you're raised in a religious culture, it's all you know. If it was a healthy community, it deeply satisfied. Walking away is painful. I went through all the stages of grief: denial, negotiation, anger, depression, before finally accepting my disbelief. For most people, leaving is a journey of 1,000 steps. And many of those steps away from religion happen before you're even aware of your dissatisfaction. Long before you finally walk away, your religious life begins to break down, to smoke and sputter, to lose momentum, until one day something inside you shifts. I remember that shift, that moment my religious life came grinding to a halt. It happened in the most ordinary of places. I was attending a summer cookout and eating a hot dog and shooting the breeze with some neighbors when one of them asked, "Are you a Quaker?" When I replied that I was, they asked, "Well, what do Quakers believe?" Now, that wasn't a hard question. I'd answered it 100 times. I could quickly and easily explain the Quaker testimonies, that all Quakers valued simplicity and peace and integrity and community and equality, that we sought to live out these testimonies in response to God's love for us, to live as faithfully as possible to the light within. As religious expressions go, that's not bad. But on that summer night, something shifted. Instead, I replied, Quakers are committed to the 5 testimonies: simplicity, peace, integrity, community, and equality. They seek to live out these testimonies in response to God's love, to live faithfully as possible to the light within. If you didn't catch the difference, I'm not surprised. Though I immediately sensed something was wrong, it wasn't until later that I realized what had changed. 2 words. On that summer night, for the first time in my religious life, instead of saying we and us, I said they and them. The end of faith sneaks up on you. One moment you're a Christian, and the next you're not. Though outwardly everything appears the same, you know something central to how you understand yourself has changed, and you can't go back, even if you wanted to. And you begin to walk away. You discover that leaving a religion is like walking away from a mountain. At that cookout 6 years ago, when I crossed that line between we and they, I took the first step away from my religion. But religions, like mountains, are massive landscapes, and no one escapes their shadow quickly. It was several months before I resigned as a pastor, nearly 2 years before I stopped attending worship services, and 4 years before I finally recognized I wasn't Christian anymore. It takes a long time to walk away from a mountain. And in the beginning, it fills the sky behind you. As you walk away, you're constantly aware of its presence over your shoulder. You measure your progress against it. You position yourself in relationship to it. When life gets tough, you may even turn back toward it. But for most people, once you walk away from the mountain, every day it slips lower into the horizon until one day its highest peaks disappear. And you find yourself in uncharted territory, wonderfully lost, but with no choice but to explore the lush world around you. That's where I stand tonight. I'm nervous, but mostly delighted. Having left the comfortable confines of church, I'm packing a tent. I've traded my map with the path between cradle and grave drawn in indelible ink for a compass. I'm heading cross country, no longer traveling the straight and narrow or carefully following the footsteps of the saints of old. I'm free to go anywhere. Tonight, I find that possibility terribly exciting. But I understand that what now excites me wasn't always as thrilling. Sometimes I was afraid. Other times I was sad. During the past 6 years, as I've walked away from the mountain, there have been risks, moments when I faced choices with unknown ramifications. Tonight, before we talk about the rewards of becoming non-religious, we need to honestly acknowledge the risks. In my experience, there are at least three kinds of risks when you walk away from your religion. First, there's the risk of ignoring your religion's warnings. And then there's the risk of losing people that you love. And finally, there's the risk of never really becoming non-religious. I want to talk about each of these in turn. One of the earliest risks of leaving your religion is the risk of ignoring its warnings about the consequences of that decision. When I was a child, I was taught a grim list of the penalties for those who left the church. They risked misery, hopelessness, and debauchery, the end of God's favor, blessing, and protection, being lost and alone, and being cast into the fires of hell. As a child, these possibilities were terrifying. As a religious adult, while I took them less literally, I still took them seriously. What if the warnings prove true? Today, when people ask, what if Christianity is right and you end up in hell? I try not to be smug. There was a time when I feared such things, when part of the reason I was religious was to escape punishment. It took many years and penning 2 books to completely shake that belief in hell. And even then, I was reluctant to let go of my assumption that the religious life was the best life. Leaving your religion seemed risky. Once I walked away from religion, I quickly discovered it wasn't. That religious people don't know much about the country beyond the mountain. Life was not miserable and hopeless. The non-religious were not wild hedonists bent on immoral living. You didn't suddenly experience a poor quality of life without God's blessing and protection. And as for the fires of hell, who could say? But it seemed a tale designed to keep people in the fold. Most of my religion's warnings turned out to be dubious. Only 2 of them proved it all true, and the first was inaccurate. I'd been warned that once I left the church, I would be lost. And on that, they were right. When I wandered away from the mountain, I did feel lost. All the familiar landmarks were gone. And it took me a while to figure out that what religious people describe as being lost was ironically not so much a consequence, but an opportunity. It was exactly what I sought. I was tired of inadequate answers to tough questions. I was tired of beliefs that didn't match my experience, of practices that no longer inspired. I was looking for the unfamiliar, for new opinions, thoughts, and encounters. I was ready to explore. I hadn't lost my faith. I simply had faith in different things, including myself. I hadn't lost my way. I'd simply chosen a different path. I hadn't lost my appreciation of the mysterious. I had simply surrendered the need to package such moments. Looking back, it was when I was most dissatisfied with my religion that I was truly lost. Toward the end of my religious life, I'd lost my passion, my courage, my integrity, my self-esteem. Surrounded by the familiar and certain, I'd begun to feel like a stranger and a fraud. I didn't lose myself in leaving. I found myself. What I lost, what I really risked, was not the loss of certain beliefs, but the loss of the community gathered around those beliefs. The only warning of my religion that proved completely true was how lonely it can feel when you first leave. Leaving your religion usually involves the loss of people you love. For many of us, our deepest relationships began within a religious community. My parents, siblings, and closest friends shared that community. For some, children and spouse are deeply committed to the religion. Most of these people continue to be happy and satisfied with their religious life, and many of them will never understand your decision. When you leave, no one throws you a going-away party. I've had some family and friends disconnect and distance themselves. A few have begged me to return. Others have expressed deep disappointment in my decision. In leaving your religion, you legitimately risk much of the support that you've depended upon for all your life. Until I left, I didn't realize how many of my needs the church met. The church was the social, emotional, and psychological Walmart of my life. All my needs were met under one roof. When you walk away from that, there's real loss. I suspect that many who stay in religion remain in religious traditions, not because they share the beliefs of that tradition, but because they still treasure the relationships. And giving lip service to ancient creeds that few understand in order to maintain membership in a community may be a shrewd trade. Since I made that trade for several years, I won't be too critical of it. The problem was that this compromise left me increasingly unhappy. I had to pretend to hold beliefs that I found unbelievable, to participate in practices that had become meaningless, to listen to sermons and prayers, some that I was preaching, that I found incredible, and to be ashamed of my identity as a Christian. For many, remaining in a religious community is a constant battle between your need for authenticity and your need for intimacy. In the end, I had to trust my family and friends, that those who loved me best would want me to be happy. They would either come to accept my new identity or figure out other ways to remain connected. And in most cases, that happened. But I won't pretend my experience is universal. For some, leaving your religion means risking every important relationship you have. And in such cases, I deeply respect those willing to still walk away. Unfortunately, walking away is not the end of danger. The most dangerous risk in leaving religion is in never becoming non-religious. And this manifests itself in two temptations. The first temptation is to become anti-religious. Sometimes, instead of turning your back and walking away, you leave the mountain and you find a higher place to build fortifications. You choose to debate instead of reflect, to defend instead of explain, and to fight instead of explore. And this is so tempting. When you first leave, you're often insecure, and a good fight feels better than fleeing aimlessly. Unfortunately, when you define your life as a battle instead of a journey, your goal becomes philosophical victory instead of personal awareness. You elect to define yourself by what you disbelieve rather than by what you dream. And in so doing, you risk forever facing the mountain with your back to the very country that you wanted to explore. The second temptation is to settle in the first familiar place. Many people leave their religions and immediately seek another community with similar characteristics. I sought this for a while. I looked around for something that was exactly like the church, but wasn't the church. Frightened by the unknown, I looked for another sanctuary. This need for sanctuary exposed a deeply ingrained religious assumption that there is no goodness or happiness beyond the mountain. But I realized if I was unable to abandon that assumption, I would simply flee from sanctuary to sanctuary. In walking away from religion, you're deciding that there's goodness and happiness to be found almost anywhere. There's no longer the need for the holy and the secular, and this may be the heart of becoming non-religious. You willingly leave the peaceful meadow to explore over the next ridge. You seek the meaningful but in a variety of places and with a variety of people. A stroll through the forest may remind you of a moment in the temple or cathedral or mosque. But you understand that people were strolling in forests long before anyone built a temple, cathedral, or mosque. In these two temptations, the temptation to fight or to settle too quickly, those who leave religion risk never really becoming non-religious. Fortunately, the farther I've journeyed from the mountain, the less I wanted to fight or to settle. Though it's taken 6 years to reach this point, leaving the mountain doesn't seem risky anymore. There's too much to see, too much to explore. There's so much that I would like to say about the rewards of the non-religious life, but the time constraints tonight require me to limit it to 3 things: free time, personal autonomy, and a broader view of the world. My first reward in leaving religion was the gift of time. Until I left, I'd had no idea how much time I had spent in religious endeavors. When I figured it out, I spent at least 10 or 15 hours a week sustaining my religious life. Leaving felt like going on vacation. I fell in love with weekends, this fantastic human invention where people take 2 entire days to reflect and rest. And the first few Sunday mornings were incredible. I turned off the alarm. I woke slowly next to my wife. I went to get the paper and coffee. I welcomed our young daughter into our bed. We talked and laughed together. Eventually, I poured our daughter a bowl of cereal and set her up in the living room in front of the TV with cartoons. I returned to our bedroom, I locked the door, and I made love to my wife. That never happened at church. Every time we tried, we got in trouble. If the religious knew what the non-religious were doing while they were in worship, churches and temples and mosques would probably empty. Religion is good at filling time. As a former pastor, I spent most of my life inventing events and activities and obligations for religious people. I gave the impression that the best Christians were those who spent the most time away from home and family and busy doing the work of the church. If I have any regrets, it is in creating the impression that idle hands were the devil's workshop, because they are not. Though the non-religious can certainly fill up their lives with business as easily as the religious, so much of the religious life was about obligation. I did many things not because they brought me joy, but because I thought I had to meet some expectation of God or of my religion. The religious life often felt frantic. And though I'd been promised eternity, there was never enough hours in the day to do all that was expected. For me, one of the richest rewards of the non-religious life was the freedom to order my life based on what brought me happiness, to do what worked, and to stop doing what didn't. The choice was mine. I soon discovered this freedom was possible in every aspect of my life. I was no longer a servant of God, beholden to God for my marching orders. I was no longer a child of God, forever dependent upon a heavenly parent. While that may have felt comforting at times, children and servants aren't expected to make decisions. They're told what to do, and their worth is measured by their obedience. When I became a non-religious person, I accepted my identity as a free moral agent. My life belonged to me. I could act and think and feel and engage in ways that I chose. I could read Bertrand Russell and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris in public. I could stop nodding my head when people made existential claims I found absurd. I could quit feeling guilty for doing things I didn't find objectionable. I could think and say things without fearing censor. I could interact freely with people I'd once seen as odd or even dangerous, In a single word, one of the greatest rewards of the non-religious life is freedom. I'm as free tonight as I've ever been. And though I may not choose to do everything, I can do anything. And this is heady stuff. And sometimes those of us who leave religions don't handle this well. Some wander down dangerous paths that they later regret. Non-religious folk don't always make the right choices, but it's our choice. And when we do what we don't do it out of obligation. You know, I always thought of myself as a thinker when I was religious, but I've discovered that I was more of a believer. Though the words believe and think are used interchangeably, they are not the same. To believe is to trust, to have faith in, to accept as true. And religions value and create believers. This is not to suggest that religious people don't think. The problem is that believing has become the predominant verb for religion. It so governs that in some religious circles, thinking is discouraged and intellectual inquiry mocked. When the religious do think, they're often discouraged from thinking about a whole range of questions and topics. Some thoughts are blasphemous. But free thinkers ignore such things. They get to consider all they encounter, ponder the possibilities, reflect on their prejudices, theorize about what might be, and experiment. The words they utter carry no universal authority or divine inspiration. They must be judged on their merits, trusted only if they resonate. And when thoughts prove inadequate, they can choose to think differently. Changing your opinion is not nearly as ominous as changing your beliefs. This newfound freedom includes the freedom of association. When I was religious, there were people I chose not to associate with because they thought differently than I. If I did talk with them, it was often with the agenda of altering their beliefs. And I was taught to pity those who did not share my religious conviction. One of the rewards of becoming non-religious has been the freedom to engage people without an agenda, to listen attentively to their story. And that brings me to my final reward to focus on tonight. Becoming non-religious has broadened my view of the world. Oddly, when I lived on the mountain, I saw the rest of the world as flat and featureless. And it was only when I walked down into the world did I discover its diverse contours. I was able to hear new stories and opinions. I was able to abandon my need for certainty and live in ambiguity. One of the hardest religious assumptions to abandon is that there is only one way, one answer, one opinion, and one story. Until I left, I hadn't understood the oppressive power of a single narrative to diminish your ability to live in the world. For example, I considered myself a well-read and informed person, someone who thoroughly understood the history of religion in the United States. So you can imagine my surprise when after leaving religion, I stumbled on the writings of Robert Ingersoll. How many of you know of Ingersoll? A few. Robert Ingersoll was one of the most famous orators of the late 1800s, capable of filling the largest auditoriums with people willing to pay $1, an outrageous cost in that day, to hear him speak for as much as 3 hours. And what did Ingersoll speak on? Atheism. Let me read you one of my favorite Ingersoll quotes. While I am opposed to all orthodox creeds, I have a creed myself. And my creed is this: happiness is the only good. The time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others so. This creed is somewhat short, but it's long enough for this life and strong enough for this world. And if there is another world, when we get there, we can make another creed. But this creed certainly will do for now. How was it possible that I, a well-read religious intellectual, had gone my entire life without reading one word by the most famous American religious critic of the 19th century. Simply said, religions generate and protect a single story, one that leaves out any counter story. And that single story, once created, has the ability to control how we understand our world. In the story I was given, Robert Ingersoll, one of the most prominent orators of the 19th century, never existed. I can understand the world so much better when I hear multiple stories, even if I may not choose to adopt all that they say. By abandoning the primary story of my life, the Christian one, I'm able to listen more openly to stories I previously discounted, to incorporate some of their story into mine. You know, I've been fascinated by the TED Talks and TEDx speeches. The first time I heard one, I immediately knew what I was hearing. And it was something I had missed in leaving religion. TED Talk sounded like a good sermon. And this format invited different perspectives to share the same stage. And in the hearing of multiple stories, it offered the opportunity to see a broader view of the world. When people ask me what will replace religion for the non-religious, I reply that it won't be any single thing. But I suspect TED Talks and the like are part of whatever is coming. You see, one of the values embedded in a non-religious culture is a commitment to embrace uncertainty. As I look back, much of my religious life was focused on supplying answers. I was taught a list of certainties about God and the world and encouraged to offer those answers asked or unasked. When faced with difficult questions about human suffering and destiny and meaning, the religious response was seldom, "I don't know." In the past couple of years, I've learned that "I don't know" is not an admission of defeat or the beginning of despair. As an explorer in the world, acknowledging what I don't know is a good starting place. I'm free to look elsewhere for explanations, expecting that if I am courageous and curious, some mysteries will be solved. Others will be less mysterious, and still others will remain forever unknown. I just don't know which mysteries will be which. And this is the beauty of the non-religious life for me. It values rather than fears the ambiguous, uncertain, unknown. It's more fluid, willing to utilize a variety of words and stories to describe a single experience. It's more personal, allowing each of us to offer our unique perspectives on what we see, hear, and feel. I'm learning to tell people what I think instead of what I believe, and to admit what I do not know. Which brings me to my final word. I've learned quickly that whenever I talk about becoming non-religious, the first question I'm invariably asked is, do you still believe in God? Over the past 6 years, I've tried on many responses to that question. At first, when living in the shadow of the mountain, I replied quickly, of course. But gradually, I realized that it was a half-truth. In most circumstances, I didn't believe in the God of my questioner. And over time, I learned to respond by asking, tell me about the God you believe in, and I'll tell you whether I believe in that God. That usually ends the conversation. But I won't let it tonight. Does God exist? After spending nearly 50 years of my life studying God, seeking some kind of relationship, and defending God's existence, I don't know. But if you want my opinion, I think in moments like tonight, when I allow myself to be honest and authentic, and when I share time and space with other people trying to do the same, I often experience a mysterious connection with myself and with them. And I feel that connection tonight. I used to call it God. Now, I just call it happiness. Thank you for listening so long and so well.